Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Koral. I'm Senior Regulatory General Counsel, for Sovos ShipCompliant, and I am very happy to be back here talking to you all at the uh, Craft Brewers Professionals Spring Conference. This is a repeat performance for me. It's always a great opportunity to get out here, talk to everybody. This is really such a great program, and I hope you're all enjoying it, and we'll continue to enjoy it through today and tomorrow to hear all from all the great speakers they have talking about issues affecting the craft beer industry and things you should know. So again, just thank you to Andrew and everybody for inviting me back, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me. As I said, my name is Alex Koral, Regulatory General Counsel with Sovos ShipCompliant, and I am here today to talk to you about non-alcoholic beer or very low alcoholic content beer, and some of the compliance concerns, regulatory concerns that go along with selling this growing product. There is, I think a lot of interest in non-alcoholic beer. Clearly, this is a rising product type. A lot of consumers are interested in it. A lot of breweries are interested in it. But there are still compliance concerns around this, as it is at least an alcoholic adjacent product. So there are a lot of concerns that you should be aware of and things to be checking on before you just go out and start selling this product. It may be a lot easier in ways than selling a full strength beer, but it's there's still issues. So we want to address some of these, make you a little bit aware of what's out there so you can be a knowledgeable producer and seller of these products. Just as a little bit of a quick background, in case you haven't heard me speak at one of these before, I work at a company, Sovos ShipCompliant, which is a leading software provider of compliance support for the beverage alcohol industry. We provide a full suite of services for interstate distribution and interstate shipping of alcohol. So a lot of licensing management, brand label registrations, and a full suite of shipping reports that you may need if you are selling your products across state borders. We also have a full line of direct consumer shipping services if you are interested in that as well. It's a lot of our focus may be on the wine industry, but we see this as a very growth area for beer as well. And so we want to serve you all and to do whatever we can to help you and make it a little bit easier for you to sell your product and get out into stores. Having that gotten by, we can move on to actual presentation today about non-alcoholic beer. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about what this product is, what it means, and why it might be regulated. I'm going to spend a lot more time focusing on the federal rules, because that is, frankly, where we see a lot of where there are actual rules about them. And these are rules that would apply wherever you're selling it. So if you are going to be selling this product, even just in your tasting room, some of these rules may apply, so you would want to be aware of them. And then I'll talk a little bit about the various state rules about non-alcoholic beer. I'm not going to be quite doing a state by state, what does Alaska do, what does Alabama do, because I think that could get really boring. But we'll talk a little bit about the broad concerns that are out there and what you should know, and so you can be knowledgeable and ask questions to your counsel and other experts as you do begin your distribution process. I should note that this is still a regulated commodity, and there are a lot of nuances. There are a lot of variations on how these rules can apply based on specific circumstances. So don't take anything I'm saying as the cardinal truth. I hope that you can rely on what I'm saying and use this as information to build on. But when you're going to do anything yourself, always do get personalized advice that is aware of your specific situation, your specific processes, so you can understand why you are going to be regulated and not how this is regulated in general. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the actual gist. So what do we mean when we're talking about regulating non-alcoholic beer? What is this? What are we really talking about? And I think, in a lot of ways, and I remember growing up, non-alcoholic beer was kind of this roll your eyes niche product that, what is anybody really doing about this? Why is it a thing? Because don't we want full strength IPAs and double imperials and all of that? And the answer is that there really has been a sea change in the last, so many years. both of awareness among consumers about the options of non-alcoholic beer, and frankly, among the abilities of brewers to make non-alcoholic beer that people actually want to drink. And so we are seeing this once niche product really becoming much more mainstream, much more commonplace, and something that really has a place among every other beer that you might have on your menu. It's great if you're making those double imperial IPAs. People want that, but there are people who might want a non-alcoholic beer that is still getting that flavor profile they love, but is not quite of the other consequences of drinking beer. So there are these health consciousness elements to it. Not only among people who cannot drink or do not want to drink for various reasons. In fact, a lot of regular beer drinkers want the alternative as well. It may be a little bit earlier in the day, but they still want that flavor. They still want the product they enjoy. They just don't necessarily want the alcoholic content. And so this is why it can be a valuable product. And we're seeing this really take effect in the market. For instance, the Brewers Association has noted from 2020 to 2021 how non-alcoholic beer grew by over 30% as a beer segment, one of the fastest growing segments clearly of the beer market, largely as a response to this consumer demand. And in fact, they're saying that non-alcoholic beer might even become more than 5% of the entire beer market in the coming years. So again, there's clearly this interest, clearly this desire, and you would be doing well, I think, to at least consider looking into this product and understanding what it takes to make it and what your consumers might like. Because again, it's not just O'Doul's, it's not just this, what is this sitting out there in the corner of the coolers anymore. This is a very legitimate, very real product that consumers want, and so this is why this is the moment, I think, to engage. But it still is a regulated product. It is still at least beer adjacent, alcohol adjacent. And so that means there are rules, restrictions, regulations around it and how you can produce it, market it, sell it, consume it, all those things. There are still restrictions. And you need to be aware of that because, if you just try to sell it like juice, it's not really going to be very successful. You're going to get probably into some trouble at some point, and nobody wants that. So you should be aware of, broadly at least, of what are the rules so you can make sure you're following them. Now, like any other product, it kind of depends on what the rules are, depends on a few factors. A key one is what is the jurisdiction you're going to be selling it in. And so if you're going to be selling it in the United States, you need to be aware of the federal rules. These are the rules set down in the federal code, administered by the Tax and Trade Bureau, and they will apply to pretty much all non-alcoholic beer sold in the United States. There are some variations on if it is only going to be sold in your tasting room versus if it's going to be distributed across state borders. But broadly, there are those restrictions that would apply, again, anything sold in the United States. However, then we have these things called the states, and they have their own rules as well. And so if you're going to be distributing your product into, Texas, New York, you need to be aware of the different rules that may be in place if you're in Texas or New York, because there are those slight variations. And so again, it's being aware of where your product is being sold to understand what rules may apply. The other thing is to understand what you are actually producing, because how your product is made, what it is made from, and all these different considerations then can apply different rules. It's got to follow the definition of how a jurisdiction defines non-alcoholic beer in order to fall under the regulations for that product. If your product does not meet the definitions as set out in the codes, the regulations, then it may be subject to different regulations, or it may not be subject to those regulations at all. So again, understanding where you're selling it and understanding what you're selling is really the key to getting this background of what laws and restrictions may apply. So having that written down, let's dig into what are some of these definitions. And again, starting at the federal level, because again, this is really going to provide the background for even what most states, how they define and regulate non-alcoholic beer. A lot of them do follow these federal rules. And so we really want to have a good, solid understanding of the federal definitions so you can apply them further. Now, alcohol is subject to two different federal statutory codes. And this applies to full-strength beer, wine, spirits, everything, and non-alcoholic beer, you have to look at two different federal codes. First, there is the Internal Revenue Code, the IRC, and these are also attached to the specific regulations that are found in Part 25 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Confusingly, a lot of rules exist in two different places. There are the codes, the statutes, which are very broad, applicable rules. They set out definitions and processes. And then there are the regulations that will get into a lot of the nitty-gritty details of how those definitions, how those rules actually apply. So that's what I mean by, we have the IRC, that's the statute, and then the Part 25 of the CFR, those are the regulations, and they're just associated. Again, if you're getting confused by this, no shame in asking professional help, getting counsel, getting attorney, because this is essentially why people go to law school, is to understand these nuanced differences. But I'll try to explain them broadly anyway. So, because shouldn't be too difficult to understand. Anyway, it's IRC is where we find a lot of basic rules, including licensing, label rules. This is also where we set out what are federal taxes that apply to beer and non-alcoholic beer, as it may be. The other codes we need to look at are the Federal Alcohol Administration Act and their associated regulations found in Part 7 of the CFR. The Federal Alcohol Administration Act, the FAAA, again, they also have a lot of these basic rules around licensing, labeling restrictions, and this is where we also would find the certificate of label approval requirements. And so, again, there are these different various rules that apply in these different codes. There is a lot of overlap, but you need to understand whether your product is subject to one or both or neither of these codes to understand how your product may be regulated at the federal level. So let's dig into the definitions. First off, we're going to look at the Internal Revenue Code. Here we're looking at two very broad categories of product. These are separate categories. And you can see we have beer. As defined, as named in the IRC, that is the word they use for this product. Beer, as defined in the IRC, is a fermented beverage that is brewed from malt or any substitute of malt and contains an alcoholic content greater than 0.5% ABV. This is as opposed to the product called cereal beverage. Again, that is the name used in the IRC, cereal beverage. This is a beverage product, so a drinkable, consumable good that is derived from malt or malt substitutes. It may be fermented, but it does not need to be fermented. And importantly, when it is going to be consumed, it has an alcoholic content less than 0.5% ABV. That 0.5% ABV is really the gold standard of threshold for non-alcoholic versus alcoholic. Again, if you're drinking something at 1%, you're probably not at 1.0%, excuse me, probably not going to feel it all that much, but there is a world of difference in the terms of regulations and laws from something that is even 0.7% and something that is 0.3%. So being aware of that threshold is very key. But you can see how these are two different separate products. There are specific requirements that will determine if they are either a beer under the IRC or a cereal beverage under the IRC. And then if you're making a product that is not derived from malts at all, well, frankly, this presentation probably really isn't for you, because then you're not making anything even remotely related to a beer, at least under the IRC. And so, maybe look around. We'll try to find you some other information about that elsewhere. Let's move on now to the Federal Alcohol Administration Act definitions. And this, importantly, are not two different categories of products. This is more of a broad category of products and then a subset of products under the FAAA. So under the FAAA, they have this broad category called a malt beverage. That's the term used in this code. This is a fermented beverage that is composed of or derived from both malted barleys and hops. It may also contain other additives and flavorings, but the key thing is that it is both fermented and it contains both malted barley and hops. If it does not have all of those factors in it, then it is not a malt beverage as defined by the FAAA, and is probably therefore not subject to the restrictions under or the regulations under the FAAA. If it's if it's distilled, then it's a spirit. If it's made from fruits or vegetables, it's a wine under the FAAA. But if it's a different type of product, made from neutral grains, does not contain hops, then it is not subject to these definitions, and therefore not subject to these rules. However, you should note that under the FAAA, we have this separate category type of malt beverage called a cereal beverage. And yes, confusingly, the FAAA uses the same name as in the IRCC for this low alcoholic product of cereal beverage. So I'm going to be using those interchangeably. I'll try to indicate where it's a cereal beverage under the IRC versus a cereal beverage under the FAAA. But again, this is just the confusing way that laws are written. But here we have the cereal beverage under the FAAA, which is a type of malt beverage. So it's got to be a fermented product derived from barley and hops. And it is specifically one that has an alcoholic content of less than 0.5% ABV. So under the IRC and the FAAA, we really have these kind of 3.5 different products. You have under the IRC, beer and cereal beverage. The big difference being that alcoholic content and whether it is or is not fermented. And then under the FAAA, we have this sort of 1.5 products. The one is really the malt beverages, fermented barley and hops. And then there's this category of malt beverage that has an alcoholic content less than 0.5%. That's the cereal beverage that you may be looking to sell as a non-alcoholic beer, as it were. And again, just to reiterate, very important to note that if your product does not meet these definitions, it is not subject to that code. So again, if you are making a product, no hops, then it is not subject to the FAAA. And so you can kind of ignore some of those regulations. And I'll try to indicate where those nuances would play up in federal rules. But again, this just gets back to that basic understanding of what are you making and then how can it be regulated. And I'm sorry if I keep reiterating that, if you're all bored with me stressing this, but I think it is important to note, again, these differences so you understand where we're really going to be starting out when it comes to what regulations apply. So what regulations might apply? A key one is taxes. This is something that is going to affect you directly if you would owe them. It's going to affect the cost of your product. So it's very important to understand when and where your product may be subject to federal excise taxes, at least. Different rules in the states. We'll talk about those maybe in a minute. But at least at the federal level, it's key to note that federal taxes are only set out in the Internal Revenue Code, not in the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. And so therefore, if your product is going to be taxable, it must meet one of those definitions under the IRC. So if your product is an IRC regulated product, it may be subject to taxes. However, the IRC does specifically note that all products with an ABV less than 0.5% are non-taxable. And so this broadly means that non-alcoholic beer, defining that as that 0.5% threshold, are not subject to federal alcohol taxes. And that can be a great boon for that product. Maybe it's a little bit cheaper to produce, cheaper to sell then. There are going to be some other considerations about identifying it, but it's key to note that these are not subject to federal alcohol taxes. And you don't need to worry about that FAAA consideration either, because that taxes do not apply under that code. It's only under the IRC. I should note that cereal beverages, as defined by the IRC, must still be reported. You'll note on your brewer's report of operations, there is that category of cereal beverages that would be reported to the TTB. You can report them in whole barrels, at least. And note that they are going to be an exempt product, not subject to the tax, but the TTB still wants to have a record of what your production is. And so you would still need to be monitoring your total production, your volumes, all those gallonages, but they should not be subject to taxes. So again, it's just being aware of what kind of accounting reporting you may need to do. But overall, good news. If it's going to be that under that 0.5%, not subject to taxes. Moving on, the other key consideration is, well, who can make non-alcoholic beer and under what considerations? As you're, I'm sure, very well aware, licensing is a key part of alcohol production. Understanding when, where, and who can be producing beer. There are almost always a license required for that. And there are some nuances with it when it comes to non-alcoholic beer. So the first consideration is that, what do you need to have a brewer's notice to make this product? And the answer is, it depends. Because a brewer's notice is required if you're going to be making malt beverages as defined by the FAAA. So again, it's those malted barley and hops products that are fermented. If you're going to be doing that of any alcoholic content, that would require a brewer's notice. That would require licensing from the TTB, and having all of those considerations and having that license in hand. There is that slight difference when it comes to IRC cereal beverages. So if you are making a non-hopped product, non-fermented product, but it is still a cereal beverage as defined by the IRC. Let's see. I think my screen might have just quit down, so I'm going to try and share that again. Sorry for the delay. But again, if you are making a cereal beverage as defined by the IRC, that may be made at a brewery. That is a specific consideration allowed under the IRC. It does not need to be made at a brewery. Again, if it's a non-malt beverage product. Sorry, I'm getting confused myself. It may be brewed at a brewery, so there's no risks of consideration there. But it's not required if you are just making a cereal beverage as defined. Thank you. Sorry for that interruption. If you're just making a cereal beverage, a not malt beverage, it can be made at a brewery, but again, not required to be. So malt beverage, yes, it does need a brewer's notice. Malt beverage of the FAAA, a non-malt beverage, but still a cereal beverage under the IRC, can be made at your brewery, but does not require to be. The further consideration is that you may still be required to do get an FDA registration for a production plant. So even if you're making a product that is not subject to either the IRC or the FAAA, that would it may still require FDA registration and all of that sort of a consideration, because you are making a product that is going to be consumed. And so you need to make sure it's safe and that people can consume it properly. It's important to note that depending on how you are going to make your non-alcoholic beer, that may require actually an additional licensing from the TTB, because there are specific alcoholic processes for removing the alcohol that may be considered distillation. So some of these processes include reverse osmosis or other sort of spitting out techniques that would be distilling the product in effect. If you are going to be using one of those tools to create non-alcoholic beer, that may require you to actually get a distilled spirits permit from the TTB in addition to your brewer's notice, which can be problematic to get. That's another level of proof and review that the TTB will go through to make sure that you're producing it properly. So just be aware of how you might be planning to make non-alcoholic beer, because that could require that additional permit. If you're going to be using like a non-fermenting yeast or other types of products like that, that probably would not require a distilled spirits permit, but just be aware and definitely check with your counsel, because you definitely do not want to be using a technique that would require a distilled spirits permit and not have a distilled spirits permit, because then the TTB will be very angry about that, and that could result in other action that would affect your brewer's notice as well. So don't get caught up in that. So I'll just say broadly. Another key consideration is on formulas. This is the process of essentially proving what your product is and what is in it. When you're making non-alcoholic beer, prior to production, the TTB does want to approve of your method. Again, this is that sort of review if you're going to be using a distillation process or not. So you should connect with the TTB, indicate to them that if you if you are an existing brewer and you're looking to get into non-alcoholic beer, I would recommend contacting your TTB officials, somebody there, letting them know what you plan to do, and so they can approve of the method of how you derive it. And they can also do that double check to make sure you don't need any additional licensing or anything. When it comes to non-alcoholic beer, a lot of the formula requirements that apply to full strength beer would also apply to non-alcoholic beer. Notably, formulas are a requirement under both the IRC and the FAAA. So it really would probably affect most of these any malt products. Again, looking back, that IRC is really a much broader definition of products. So it's probably going to hit a lot more non-alcoholic beers out there. And so since the formula requirements are part of the IRC, you should be aware of these formula requirements, because that is another step on the road to getting your product into market, is having that approval from the TTB that they can acknowledge that you are using safe products and ingredients in that. Notably, and this is going to be a little bit obscure, but there was a ruling in 2015, this TTB ruling 2015-1, which was really a boon for the beer industry, as it exempted formula approvals for a lot of more standard ingredients. Broadly, a formula is required if you're going to be using any non-traditional ingredients in producing beer. And so that's basically anything besides water, malt, hops, and yeast. That's kind of the original definition of when you need a formula. This TTB ruling 2015 added a lot of other standard ingredients, such as fruit juices, fruit flavorings, honey, such like that, where you would not require to get a formula. Notably, this ruling does not apply to non-alcoholic beer. It only applies to the beer as defined under the IRC, but not cereal beverages. And therefore, if you are going to make a non-alcoholic beer, that's cereal beverage as defined by the IRC, and include some of these, non-traditional but more standard ingredients, such as honey or fruit flavorings, you may need to get a formula for that before you start selling it in commerce. And that may even be required if you're only going to be selling it in your brew pub. So just be aware of those restrictions, be aware of that requirement, and check on that. Because that can certainly delay your time to market if you're going to be trying to do this in any timely fashion. And formulas can be a little bit tricky to get approved from the TTB. So you just want to get ahead of that so you're not held up by any regulatory bureaucratic restrictions. Notably, if your product is going to be completely alcohol-free, 0.0%, you would probably need to also submit a lab sample of that for proof that it is truly non-alcoholic at all. If you have that slight 0.1%, no lab analysis would be required unless there are other considerations that would make lab analysis required. But if it is going to be truly 0.0, then the TTB does want to be able to verify that, which does lead on to really where there are a lot more restrictions and regulations, and where I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about these federal rules, is in labeling. And how do you identify if your product is truly non-alcoholic, or if it's just effectively non-alcoholic? What are the rules and restrictions about labeling your non-alcoholic beer? Because frankly, there are a lot. Rules on labels, what must appear on your label, what cannot appear on your label, are found in both the IRC and the FAAA. So again, if your product is any of these malt-derived products, they'd be subject to at least the IRC, if not also the FAAA. And so you want to be aware of these restrictions. Helpfully, at least, these are pretty much the same rules and restrictions that apply to full-strength beer. And so if you're already doing your labels correctly, which I certainly hope you are, you should be aware of what these basic requirements are. And so there are these standard label requirements, such as identifying the producer, the location of production, identifying the type of product, which is even more than just beer or malt beverage, but it might even be getting into more nuanced descriptions, and also identifying properly the volume. Using that imperial measurements, the 1 pint, not 16 ounces, all those restrictions. those apply to non-alcoholic beer just as they do to full-strength beer. One of the key considerations, again, is that indicating the type. So notably, and I'll talk a little bit more about this more in detail, is you probably cannot use the word beer if you're going to be selling a non-alcoholic beer. Again, that beer is a specific IRC definition. It's got to be a product that has greater than 0.5% ABV. And so you would need to use a different phrase. Some of the common ones, again, are cereal beverage, malt beverage, near beer. Those should all be fine to use, but you do not want to be using beer itself. Also notably, under the IRC, if you're going to be selling one of these cereal beverages, product under 0.5% ABV, because it is non-taxable, you must indicate that on the label. And so your label must have this big sticker on it, this big section that says non-taxable under section 5051 IRC. And you want it to look exactly like that, using those exact words, that exact typeface, or maybe not typeface, but formatting and everything. And it must be prominently appearing on your labels. And that is, how your the regulators, how your distributors can recognize what type of product that is under the IRC and apply those restrictions. Similarly, there are the Federal Alcohol Administration Act's rules around labeling. Again, a lot of these are very identical to the IRC, so you still have that, identify the producer, indicate the type, properly identify the volume. However, notably, the FAAA regulations, those specifically only apply to products that are sold in interstate commerce. So you'd only need to be worried about the specific FAAA regulations if you're going to be selling them across state lines. That's as opposed to the IRC rules, which apply, again, even if you're going to be selling these only out of your tap room, you would need to have your IRC labels properly formatted and printed up. But the FAA only applies if it's sold in interstate commerce. The big difference between the big additional requirement that the FAA applies, that the IRC does not, again, are the COLAs, are the certificate of label approvals. Those are the TTB pre-approval of your label that you must need to get if you're going to be selling in interstate commerce. So again, if you're going to be not selling your product in interstate commerce, or your product does not contain hops, is not fermented, and therefore is not a FAA regulated product, that COLA requirement would not apply. It's not even that it's an optional, it just is not available to you at all to get a COLA for non-FAA products, which can be a boon because, COLAs can take time, especially if they're not approved the first time. You might need to go back and do some revisions on that. So again, it's just a delay to market. So if you're understanding if your product is or is not subject to COLAs, that can save you some time. And so being aware of that is key. The other really major key consideration is that the government health warning, that big, do not consume if you're pregnant, do not use any devices, mechanical operations if you're consuming this product, that only needs to appear on products greater than 0.5% ABV. So again, non-alcoholic beers would not need that big government health warning, which is frankly kind of, it's helpful, I think, to identify to consumers, but it often trips people up when they're trying to get a COLA. That's a common area that the TBB finds some problematic formatting in on, and so that could delay you. So hopefully that government health warning not required on your non-alcoholic beer products. But what are the other, there are a lot more other rules on labeling. So what are some of them? Again, a big one is on properly identifying your product, properly identifying the class, the type of product that is being sold, because it is very central to these rules is you need to inform the consumer about what they're about to consume. I guess in the 30s, there were a lot of fears about that people were going to be, think they're drinking beer when it's actually whiskey, all those sort of things. And so there are a lot of restrictions about properly identifying your product. And these apply also to non-alcoholic beers as well. And again, these appear under both the IRC and the FAA. So as long as your product is subject to one of them, then you would need to properly identify your product. Again, the big one is that using the term beer or lager or ale, any of those kind of standard beer product types, is prohibited on non-alcoholic beer labels. It's that if it's a cereal beverage, then it cannot be one of those broader beers. It's got to be identified instead as, a generic malt beverage or specifically a cereal beverage, or near beer. Again, that's, kind of a common, I think there's a lot more colloquial understanding around what near beer is. Malt beverage, people might think that it still has alcoholic content in the cereal beverage. You probably only heard that term if you were listening to this this webinar right now. But just be aware again that there are restrictions on using the word beer or ale on your label if it is a non-alcoholic product. A lot of those restrictions do come down through the FAAA, not the IRC. So if you are only selling if you're not selling your product interstate, or if it is a non-product, then again, just be aware that there could be those restrictions on it could be allowed to use beer, but just broadly, it's probably not best to put that on your label because there could be other considerations that make that impermissible at the time. Notably, the alcoholic content statement, so that's a little line that says, 0.1% ABV or 0.0% ABV. That would only be required if it is sold interstate. That is only a requirement under the FAAA. Or I'm sorry, a little confused there. Again, a lot going on. That is actually a requirement under the IRC. However, it is only required then if it actually has a alcoholic content greater than 0.5%. It is not required on beer at all, but it might be required if it is sold interstate and it has non-beer alcoholic flavors or non-beverage ingredients that create an alcoholic content. Sorry about that. Again, there's a lot of considerations. So, alcoholic content statement not required on beer, but if it is sold interstate and it does also have alcoholic flavoring or content coming from non-beer ingredients, then you may need an alcoholic content statement. There are also some states, I think Washington is a key one out there that does require an alcoholic content statement on beer as well. But otherwise, that is only optional. And so, you can put that on or leave that off as you will. If you are going to put it on, make sure it's in the correct formatting. You're using the right abbreviations and all that sort of such so that it can be approved by the TTB. Sorry, really any confusion there. Again, this is why you should definitely also consult with anybody else after this webinar as you do make your products. Further identifying, again, when we're looking at the alcohol content, if you do want to identify that, there are specific ways that it should be done when it comes to non-alcoholic beer. So if you are making a truly non-alcoholic beer content, a non-alcoholic product, and you want to identify it as alcohol-free, that can only appear on your label if the product is truly alcohol-free and it has an alcohol content of 0.0% ABV. If it even has that 0.001% alcohol content, alcohol-free cannot appear on your label. So again, it has to be truly alcoholic-free. It does not need to appear if it's alcoholic-free, but it can be handy to identify that to consumers. The one consideration is if you are going to have any kind of alcoholic statement that says 0.0% ABV, then you also need to identify it as alcohol-free to really just reiterate that, stress it, make it very clear to consumers. The other type of identification you might want to use is just to say the more broad term non-alcoholic, which maybe is a little bit disingenuous when we're considering that as opposed to alcohol-free. But the non-alcoholic, again, broadly applies to anything that has that less than 0.5% ABV, which really is not non-intoxicating at least. So it's makes sense, at least for consumers, to see that on a label and see, okay, non-alcoholic, it is going to be very, very low alcohol content. Again, it is optional to use. You do not need to use the phrase non-alcoholic on the label. However, if you do, similarly as with alcohol-free, you need to have a statement then that says contains less than 0.5% alcohol by volume, using those specific words in that specific way on the label so that consumers can be clear about what you mean by alcohol-free versus non-alcoholic. And so they're very clearly understanding what they're getting at, what they're buying, and not have any kind of confusion there. And here we can see an example of this. And I want to really highlight, this is not my mock-up. This is something that came from a TTB presentation on low non-alcoholic beer. So thank you to the TTB for creating this mock-up. But we can see a lot of these key considerations when it comes to an acceptable label for a non-alcoholic beer. So for one, we have the standard information of who's brewing it, where it's brewing, how much volume is in the product. You could also see notably the phrase beer is never used on the label. Instead, we use terms like craft brew or malt beverage. You can see how they have very prominently displayed in the corner here, non-taxable under Section 5051 IRC. And because it does have this big prominent non-alcoholic, it also says right below that prominently contains less than 0.5% alcohol by volume. There are various ways you could do this specifically. I think you could use that ABV abbreviation. But again, this is just a key considerations of these are the things that if you're going to include them, you have to do them right. And again, there are certain things you have to include, such as that's non-taxable, certain things you cannot have, such as the word beer on your label. And again, these are things you want to be aware of, because even if you're not necessarily going to get a cola, you're not going to get that. You're not selling it interstate, so you're not going to get the TTB approval. If your label is not acceptable, that is still a reason for the TTB to issue notices, fines, other compliance enforcement acts that nobody wants to be dealing with. And so you want to be aware of these label restrictions and get them to your designer well ahead of time, so that you don't need to keep going back. You can make sure your label is good and is clear and is effective right from the get-go. So again, a lot of considerations. I would say there is some good information out there, probably a little bit clearer than I have necessarily been on this webinar from the TTB. So do look up for other resources. And again, no shame in talking to a counsel or other lawyer about these sort of considerations as you're making your products. The last thing I want to quick talk about at the federal level is FDA food labeling, because this is also a key consideration. There is an exception for FDA food labeling when it comes to products that are not subject to the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. This is a specific determination by the TTB and the FDA that if it is a malt beverage under the FAA, then the FDA rules would not apply. However, if it is not one of those products, so again, not fermented, not hops, you may need to have a FDA label on there, which is frankly a lot more nuanced, a lot more information than is required on a standard alcohol label. There are a little bit of lap over, but you want to be aware of these additional considerations. So one, you would still need to have that statement of identity, who made this, where did they make it, net contents, identify the manufacturer. The big considerations are you would need to have a formatted nutrition facts, that big label that says, calorie contents, sodium, all those different nutritional facts. There are variations on that for beverages, for alcohol or near alcoholic beer products. So you want to check with the FDA, look to their guides, look to their regulations on how to identify that. Also be aware you may need to provide a list of ingredients and a list of major allergens on your products if they are, again, not subject to the FAA. And frankly, there is a lot of nuance, a lot of very specific information that is applied at the FDA that is not necessarily there at the TTB. So while it can be costly, we really highly recommend you do consult with an expert on FDA labels if this is going to affect you, because again, there are a lot of variations, a lot of nuances, and there are a lot of experts out there. There are vastly more products that are subject to FDA food labels than there are alcoholic products. So there are a lot of experts out there helping everybody from cracker makers to juice makers get their FDA labels approved, get them done correctly. So there are resources out there. And this is definitely an area you would not want to be caught down, because This is then leading into other agencies that can have regulatory effect and can restrict your ability to produce products. So getting ahead of this, being aware of FDA food labeling is a major consideration when it comes to non-alcoholic beer and frankly, other non-standard beer products too. Anything without that both hops and malt may be subject to these FDA food labeling restrictions. That's broadly what are the basic rules out there for the federal. So again, just being aware of taxes probably do not apply. Licensing surely does. Formulas certainly do. And there are a lot of rules about labeling that you want to get ahead of. But we can quickly talk a little bit about the state level of regulations around non-alcoholic beer, because again, there are variations at the state levels. So the first thing we'll quickly talk about are, again, identifying how states define beer. Helpfully, most states do align with federal definitions of non-alcoholic beer. So that 0.5% ABV, that's really a pretty standard threshold. In pretty much every state, that's the area you need to be aware of if to say if it's going to be a non-alcoholic beer and therefore not subject to most regulations, or if it's going to be an alcoholic beer and therefore is subject to most regulations. There are a few states that have a higher non-alcoholic threshold. So for instance, Kentucky and Vermont set theirs at 1.0% ABV. And so I suppose if you are only going to sell your product in those states, producing it and selling it in those states, you may be able to get away with a little bit more restrictions on what it's going to be sold. But if it's still a 0.7%, then it's going to hit other federal regulations. And so it's not fully in the clear there. But in those states, you might have a little bit more options on where you can sell it and how. Conversely, there are several states that have no threshold for alcoholic content on beer. These are Arizona, Georgia, Idaho, New York, and Tennessee. And there, any product that is a malt beverage that meets their definition of a beer at all, regardless of ABV content, would be subject to all the beer regulations. And so you want to be aware of those and just be broadly aware of any states that might have even specific definitions of non-alcoholic beer that may apply specific regulations on non-alcoholic beer, because there are some. And so what are these kind of regulations that might apply? Well, again, it broadly follows what is active at the federal level. So there might be licenses required. Again, often a brewery license in the state where you are active, issued by that state, is often required for any type of fermented brewing, any type of action with malts. And so you want to be aware of those. Even if you are making a non-malt, non-hop product, you may still require some kind of food production license from your state. These are licenses that are required even of juice factories, of milk factories. Again, you're going to be making a product that people are consuming. And so the state's regulators want to make sure that it's being done in a safe manner, not going to be making anybody sick. So even if you are not necessarily required to get an alcoholic license for your product, if it is really outside the lines of a standard beer, you may need to get a different type of food production license. So be aware of that. And again, be aware of those states that have no minimum ABV. So for anything that is entire, that has any alcoholic content at all, you may also similarly be subject to taxes, label registrations, all those reporting requirements that would apply if it has any type of alcoholic content at all. If it's truly alcohol-free, 0.0000%, then it is probably outside of the alcohol regulations. So it may not be subject to taxes, but that's definitely something you would want to address on a state-by-state level. Talk to attorneys in those states, talk to the regulators in those states, understand what they're going to be considering, because you do not want to get caught by anything. Also be aware that there are places where even 0.0% beer is restricted. There's an interesting little consideration here is in New York. For instance, New York prohibits liquor stores from selling any non-alcoholic products. And therefore, if your product is non-alcoholic, at 0.0%, it cannot be sold in liquor stores in New York. It cannot be sold alongside even a 0.5% alcoholic beer in New York. So just be kind of aware of where your products may be able to be sold. Similarly, Pennsylvania prohibits a sale of anything labeled a beer, anything that imitates a beer, to minors. And so again, just another consideration about what your market might be. There's a little bit of a wrinkle in Kansas. It's not quite non-alcoholic beer territory, but Kansas is kind of the last state that still has a broad category of the cereal malt beverage, that 3-2 beer, which again, not really non-alcoholic, certainly subject to federal regulations on standard beer. But within that state, at least, if it's a low ABV product, there might be some more states, more counties, more cities, more stores where it can be sold if you're big in Kansas. One major consideration when it comes to non-alcoholic beer and distribution is understanding the rules around distribution, and specifically these franchise laws, because they still may apply even to non-alcoholic beer. Again, when we are talking about non-alcoholic beer, generally they are not subject to 3-tier requirements because they fall outside of the alcoholic beer regulations, or the rules around selling beer. Again, there are those exceptional states that have no minimum threshold for non-alcoholic beer. But in most other states, it can really be sold in, I guess, non-traditional alcoholic sales methods. So it can be sold maybe in grocery stores or in other types of stores. Direct-to-consumer shipping is probably available for most non-alcoholic beer products because direct-to-consumer shipping restrictions only apply to products that are subject to state regulations on the sale of alcohol. That said, distributors do see a value in trying to help you support your non-alcoholic beer sales. And so your beer distributors may be able to help you with your non-alcoholic beer as well. However, when you're dealing with a distributor, you just always want to go into that relationship eyes wide open. You want to be very aware of what kind of contract you're signing, what kind of restrictions may be applied to that contract. And so you just want to make sure you're reading that, understand the limitations, be aware of the conditions that apply to your distribution method. If there are going to be any types of if you're having a problem with your distributor and you want to fix or cancel that, they may have provisions in your contract that limit your ability to renegotiate. All those other considerations, just broadly, whenever we talk about setting up a distributor relationship, it is a trust but verify situation. Get that read by a lawyer, get that really reviewed. Do not just sign whatever they send over to you, because there could be things that get you trapped, and you don't want to be trapped in a bad distributor relationship. And frankly, a distributor should not want to trap you. But it's just being aware of that. There are a couple states, Texas and Illinois specifically, that do include non-alcoholic beer in their franchise laws. Again, franchise laws are these state statutes that restrict how you can contract with your distributor. They impose restrictions on your ability to renegotiate, to terminate your contract, to do any kind of reconsideration. And so be aware, Texas, Illinois specifically include non-alcoholic beer in franchise laws, which, even if you are then getting a very good contract written, those franchise laws could restrict your ability to enforce that contract, imposing further restrictions and really trapping you into a potentially negative relationship, which just means, again, talk to a counsel, talk to a lawyer, get somebody to read that who understands alcoholic laws, understands beer distribution processes, and so they can make sure you're not getting yourself trapped in a 10-year bad relationship that is not going to sell your beer, not going to sell your non-alcoholic beer, and doesn't really suit anybody. So again, this is just this broad warning about distribution, setting up distribution relationships. This is not to say that distributors are bad in any way. It's just being, go into it with your full eyes open and being aware of what may be affecting your ability to affect your distributor relationship. And very lastly, very briefly, I just want to quick talk about marketing non-alcoholic beer, because this is, again, a big consideration. There are a lot of rules and restrictions that apply on the marketing and advertising of any alcoholic product generally. And some of these do apply also to non-alcoholic beer. And so again, a lot of these restrictions are found in the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. And more nuances are found, can be read in that CFR Section 7. A lot of these deal with no false statements in your advertising, no obscene or derogatory language. You need to properly identify the product, no unsubstantiated health claims. And by unsubstantiated, I mean anything without like 4 or 5 clear scientific medical reviews about the health claim. So just be aware of those restrictions. Be aware that they probably might apply if you are making a product subject to the FAAA, which is, again, anything with malts and hops and fermented and sold interstate. However, again, even if it's not subject to the FAAA, just be aware of these rules, because there is, even if there's not necessarily a law, there is definitely a lot of standard practices, guidelines, just within the market, within the industry, best practices when it comes to advertising anything that even resembles beer. And so even if it is non-alcoholic, don't use that as an excuse to market to minors. Do not market it to minors ever. Don't even hint at that. Don't say like, well, get your taste of it. Recognize that there are all of these just more fundamental society restrictions around, removing minors from any consideration when it comes to anything that even resembles an alcoholic product. And very broadly, as we're moving into the age of social media and doing things online and trying to market through social media programs, the broad consideration there is don't do anything on social media that you would not do in real life. So if you are not able to do a health statement in a print ad, if you are not able to talk about specific retailers in a commercial ad and a radio ad, don't do that online either. It's just the same sort of rules apply kind of wherever you are marketing and advertising it. And again, even though this is even though your product may be non-alcoholic, even if it is truly alcohol-free, 0.0%, just be aware that you should be a good representative of the industry and a good marketer. And so not trying to be tongue-in-cheek about any type of references to minors or anything like that. This is still a near beer type product effectively. And so all of those near beer rules would apply to these products as well. But that said, I think that there are a lot of viability for non-alcoholic beer. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in the consumers. There's a lot of ability among brewers to make this. And so I hope I didn't scare anybody off with these rules. Again, a lot of these are about indicating where the regular rules do not apply to make it even easier to sell non-alcoholic beer. But then you also want to be aware of where rules still do apply. And so you do not end up getting caught and doing anything you shouldn't do, anything wrong. With that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate the Craft Beer Professionals organization for inviting me back to speak. I hope to be back again. Thank you all very much for listening to me, and I hope to hear you again. We might have a little bit of time for comments, but it doesn't seem like anything is coming in. I'll stick around for maybe a minute and see if any questions are coming in. Otherwise, again, I'll just say thank you so much, and I hope to see you next time.